Hi everyone, I'm Runa and I'm going to be showing you Intro to Applique. There will be a presentation version of this linked in the pop-out chat for anyone who wants to follow along. And first we're going to go over to the ironing board, so give me just a moment to move over there. So here at the ironing board, I'm going to show you some of the materials. So for this example, we're going to pretend that this yellowish golden fabric is our tunic fabric or the base for what we're going to applique on. And then the red and blue pieces are our applique pieces. So I've got my design printed out. You want it printed in the size that you want it. And the shield is a very classic, simple design, whereas the flames are a bit more complicated. So I'm going to use those to show you how I tackle like curves and some of the points there, because I get a lot of questions about those. The main thing you want to make sure is with all your fabrics that they're pre-washed so that there's no shrinkage after the fact. And we're going to iron them really well to make sure that everything is laying flat. The main thing you want to consider when choosing fabrics is they should be non-stretch for applique. Anything stretchy is just going to warp and be very weird. I have done it, but it's not pleasant. So you really just want to make sure you have a couple non-stretch materials, your design, your fabrics, and then another material we're going to need is this fusible interfacing. This is specifically Heat and Bond Light. And you can see one side is kind of shiny and that's going to get sticky when we iron it down onto the fabric. And then we're going to peel the paper off the back and iron that onto the tunic so that it sticks together while we're sewing it. You don't have to use Heat and Bond Light specifically. I have used other fusible interfacings before and they will work. I tend to prefer the Heat and Bond. And if you're going to get that brand, I would go for the light version because anything heavier can be a little stiff. And also I've heard some people have issues with it, like kind of gumming up their machines. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another material you're going to need is tearaway embroidery stabilizer. This is kind of a papery substance that's going to go on the back of the fabric that keeps everything in place so that it doesn't warp when we're sewing, and also it helps everything just move more smoothly through the machine. So you'll see kind of how I make a sandwich out of these materials as I prep everything, but essentially we have our Heat and Bond, fusible interfacing, and tearaway embroidery stabilizer. It's very important that you get the tearaway kind so that you'll be able to remove it more easily later. There are dissolvable ones that will just dissolve in water, which will work fine too. They just tend to be a little more expensive, so I tend to get the cheaper stuff. So I'm going to iron the fabric now. You want to make sure that your base fabric, whatever you're putting the applique on, is very well ironed so that when everything goes on, it lays smoothly and you can make sure that it's gonna not have any weird wrinkles or bunches underneath your applique. This is 100% linen that I'm using, and linen loves a really high temp steam iron. So, I mean, depending on what fabric you're using, you're gonna want to set your iron differently, but most natural fibers like a linen or a cotton, which is what I would most recommend using, are gonna do well with like a high heat iron because you really just want to make sure all those wrinkles are pressed out. So once I'm done ironing that main piece, I'm going to set it aside and iron the smaller pieces that are going to make up the applique. You should probably set it aside a little more carefully than I did here so it doesn't wrinkle again, but that's okay. But I just want to make sure that these smaller pieces are also ironed really well so that there's no wrinkles when I go to apply the Heat and Bond. So next I need to cut a piece of Heat and Bond that's the same size as the design. So I'm just going to lay the design underneath the Heat and Bond. And you can see that it's kind of transparent. So I just lay it on top and then cut around it with non-fabric scissors because there is a paper backing here. And you just want to cut the Heat and Bond just a little bit bigger than the design piece so that there's enough wiggle room to trace it onto there later. It doesn't have to be a lot of extra room, like maybe 1/2 inch on all sides should be enough. For this flame pattern, I'm not going to be doing the whole pattern, so I'm just cutting out enough for a section of it, just to show you guys. Next, we're going to iron the heat and bond onto the fabric. So this fabric is linen. It's a plain color and there's no difference in either side. So it really doesn't matter which side you iron it on. But if you were using something with a pattern, obviously you would want to take that into account. So I'm just placing the heat and bond with the shiny side down. You can see the shiny side goes onto the fabric, and then I'm going to iron it on, and I'm turning the steam down because the steam can make the paper backing kind of bunch up weirdly. I still am using a high heat on this, but just follow whatever the instructions for your interfacing say. Different ones have different temperatures that they like, so just do whatever the package says. And I'm pressing it down with the iron, just making sure to give it a good few seconds and a few passes all over the surface so that it sticks nicely. And then I like to also flip it over and then iron from the other side just to be double sure that it's sticking to the material, because it's going to be much harder to cut out if it's not adhered well. And then I'm just trimming off any excess. I like to leave a little bit of a border around it, but you don't need much. So doing the same thing with the blue fabric. I'm again just ironing the base fabric. You can turn the steam back on for this if you need to, but for this little piece, I didn't really feel like it needed it very much. And then I'm sticking the piece for the design on there as well. You can see it's a little tight on this one. This scrap piece that I'm using is a little small, but it's enough to cover it. So as long as you don't have any heat and bond sticking over the edge to where it's going to gunk up your ironing board, it's fine. We'll have enough space to work with. Now we need to trace the design onto the fabric somehow. So you could cut out your shape and trace it onto the backing. This heat and bond has a nice paper backing, which makes it good for drawing on. You could freehand draw or trace with a pencil. That's really convenient. But one thing you do have to remember is that if you're drawing or tracing onto the back, you have to reverse your design from the way that you want it to show up on your final piece. If you have a symmetrical design, it's not that big of a deal, but if you're tracing onto the back, you just have to remember to flip your design. Or you can trace it onto the front, like cut out your image and then trace around it with a heat erasable fabric pen or like a chalk pencil that's going to wash out or something like that. But I like to actually trace straight onto the paper with a ballpoint pen, and this way I don't have to cut out the design or anything. I just trace along the lines with a little bit of pressure. You want enough firm pressure to leave a little bit of an indent, but not so much that you're poking all the way through the paper. And I just find that this gives me a little more accuracy. It's a little easier to trace without worrying about the edges of the paper flopping around or something. And then also you can get kind of inner detail lines. So like say this shield had a design on it that I was going to then stitch as well. I could get that as well without having to cut out multiple different pieces. So when you're done tracing the design, you can see it leaves this lighter colored line that's very thin and very fine and easy to cut out and follow with scissors. You could go back in and trace over that with like a chalk pencil or that heat erasable pen if you just need to see it a little bit better, or if you need to stitch more detailed work. Sometimes I find that helpful to make it easier to see on the machine, but I'm going to go ahead and cut this one out. And you may notice I'm using fabric scissors here despite the paper backing. I just find that it's too floppy and hard to cut out if you remove the paper backing first. So I just try to spare my scissors as much as possible from the heat and bond paper, but in some points it's a bit inevitable. We have our nice shield design ready to be ironed onto our tunic or whatever it is that we're making. So I'm going to do the same thing with this flame design. This piece is actually designed to be trimmed, so that's why it's flat along one side. So you would want to line that up with a straighter edge than this, but for the purposes of demonstration, I'm just going to trace out a small section of it for you here and not worry about the bottom too much. So you can see just like before, the slight outline is left behind and I can use that to cut out my piece. This one is a little bit trickier to cut out just because of those tight curves and angles. If I was doing this, normally I would probably get a smaller pair of scissors. Some smaller embroidery scissors really make it easy to clip into those really tiny spots on certain designs, but I'm just don't want to go get mine right now, so I'm using the big scissors. So now we're ready to iron our applique pieces onto our base tunic piece or whatever. We've got them all prepped and ready to go. And I'm just making sure that the tunic is flat still. Make sure that there's no weird wrinkles for when I place the applique piece down. And I'm going to peel off that paper backing. Sometimes it's easiest to get it from a corner. It comes off fairly easily. You just kind of have to work at the edge until you can get it pulled up. And you can see one side is shiny still. That's the side that's going to get sticky when we iron it. So I'm just going to place it shiny side down onto the fabric. And you want to be very careful about the positioning of your piece. You want to make sure that the grain lines are matching up. That's kind of, you can see the fabric running side to side and top to bottom. It doesn't have to be like super precise, but you just want to make sure that your one applique piece isn't like totally diagonal, because the grain lines, you can see there's a little bit of stretch on the bias, which is that diagonal grain, and that will tend to warp over time if they're not matched up. And then, of course, you want to also make sure that it's in the position you want it. You can get an applique piece pulled off once you've ironed it, but it is not going to come off cleanly and it's not going to look very nice. So you just want to make sure that it's in the position you want it in before you iron it down. So now that the piece is in place, I'm ironing it down, just moving slowly across the surface, making sure that all parts of the design get an even heat with the iron to make sure that it sticks down nicely. And sometimes if you have a design that is kind of fiddly or has a lot of small pieces, like the tendrils of the flames here could kind of be fiddly to iron down. You just want to make sure when you place it down that everything's lying flat and that they're not wrinkled or warped in any way. You kind of just have to move the fabric around until it feels like it's lying the way you want it to, and then coming straight down with the iron can prevent the iron from moving your pieces as you press them. So you kind of just come straight down on one section and then again on another section until they get that initial bit of stickage, and then you can continue to press out the rest of the piece. And again, just maintaining that even pressure, kind of smoothing over the design slowly and pressing outwards so that all of the little bits are stuck down securely. And now you can see that that piece is stuck to the fabric. It's not going anywhere. You could get it pulled up if you really worked at it, but it's secure enough for now because we really just need it to hold on long enough to sew it down. And this little frayed bit at the bottom of that blue piece, normally you wouldn't have that. You would trim that off, but I just cut this out quickly as an example, and I'm not sewing along that edge. So now we're going to move over to the sewing machine and actually start stitching everything together. Okay, so basically ignore me in the corner. My mouth is not going to match up with the words. There's a little bit of an audio issue, and so I'm having to record this as a voiceover later. But we're back at the machine. I've got it threaded with embroidery thread, and I tend to like a rayon embroidery thread, particularly the Sulky or Madeira brands are great. Using embroidery thread is just going to give your applique a much smoother look, and that's how you get that kind of shiny surface without it actually being a metallic thread. Now, before we do the satin stitching, which is the applique stitch, first we're going to do what's called a stay stitch. So right now I've just got my machine set to a regular straight stitch, but with the same embroidery thread that I'm going to be using later. And you can see we've got our applique pieces ironed onto the fabric. Now there's no stabilizer or anything behind here yet. They're just ironed on. And I'm going to do the stay stitch before moving on to anything else. So I'm putting my fabric underneath the presser foot so that the needle is just on the edge of that applique piece. You want to get it as close as you can to the edge as possible without, going off. And I'm just going to stitch all the way around that design piece to secure it down. This stay stitch really helps secure the edge and keeps it from pulling out over time. And it really just improves the longevity of the piece. And I'm moving in so that you can hopefully see just how close that needle is to the edge of the design. You don't have to get quite this close. I mean, you can kind of think about when you look at applique pieces that have that wide satin stitch, it's going to cover it. You just want to make sure that it's close enough that the stitching will cover up this straight stitch in the end. So I'm just kind of moving around quickly, using the needle down on the corners to pivot and lifting the foot as I'm doing so. When I get back to the beginning of where I started, I like to just snip off that starting tail thread on both sides before I reach it because we're going to overlap that initial stitching point just to secure it all down. Depending on your piece, you may not have an overlap, and that's fine. You would just want to back stitch at the beginning and end of your stay stitch instead. So here you can see just how close that stitching is to the edge of the applique piece. So here you can see I've got some embroidery thread just to show you that shininess to it, and it's matched up to the fabric fairly close. I usually will take a swatch of fabric to the store and look at spools of thread and try to match them as close as possible to the color. Of course, that's a bit harder to do now that Joanne is no longer with us and we're shopping online, but you just want to get as close as you can. In the end, it won't be that noticeable as long as it's fairly close. Here's another spool of thread just so you can see. I use the 40 weight rayon sulky thread for most things. Like I said, the Madeira is also another brand that works. I find that the rayon has a little bit better shine and smoothness than the polyester embroidery thread, but it's kind of just a personal preference and you can experiment with different threads depending on, what you like. Here is a plain spool of thread. That's what I use for the bobbin a lot of times, just a general all-purpose thread. I like the Gunderman brand, but it's really your personal preference. So next I'm just going to stay stitch the other piece. Because this one is cut, kind of assuming it's more of a trim piece, I'm only going to do that top edge. If you were to do a trim like this as applique, you would want to make sure that the edges are enclosed in a seam and that the bottom edge is finished off when you hem the whole piece. But I'm just going around these curves, taking my time to make sure that I'm following the curve and, rotating by lifting the foot and putting the needle down as before. I'm using the same red thread here because I'm actually going to be doing the satin stitch in the same color just for contrast to kind of help you guys see a bit better. But you can also use a contrasting thread color if you want for decorative purposes. You just might have to go over the stitching multiple times when you get to the satin stitch. But whatever color your satin stitch thread is going to be, that's what color your stay stitch thread should be. Just use the same thread, keep it simple. That helps it all blend together nicer. So now it's time to add the stabilizer. So I'm just going to cut off a piece of stabilizer that's a little bit bigger than the design. You can kind of lay it on top and eyeball it. Depending on the width and size of your stabilizer, you might need multiple pieces, and that's totally fine. You can add them on all at once, or you can kind of add them on as needed. So now I'm going to place the stabilizer underneath the design on the back side of the base piece, the tunic or whatever it is. You want to make sure that the stabilizer is completely covering the design. You can flip it over to the wrong side if you need to, just to make sure that it's positioned correctly. But essentially now we have a sandwich that is applique fabric piece on top, heat and bond fusible interfacing underneath there between that and the base piece, then our base piece of fabric, our tunic, and then stabilizer. And I'm just going to pin that in place around the edges. You don't need a ton of pins here, and once you start to sew, it'll kind of be held in place by the stitching and you can take the pins out later. Now we're ready to satin stitch. So I'm going to show you the settings that I use on my machine. I'm setting it to a zigzag, which is number 4 on my machine, and setting the stitch length to the shortest it will go. Depending on your machine, you might need to go a little bit longer than this. Sometimes if you set it to like a true 0, it just won't move at all and it just doesn't work very well. So you have to set it to more like a 0.1 or more like just if you have a wheel instead of a computerized machine, you can just kind of turn the knob just ever so slightly above 0. I find that works pretty well on more mechanical machines. And then I'm setting the width to a 7 in this instance, which is the widest. That is really just what I think will work best for this piece. You can adjust the width depending on what you're doing. For finer work, you probably want a narrower width, and for more bigger pieces, you want a wider width of stitch. You really just have to kind of experiment and see what looks good to you on your piece. Maybe do a couple of sample stitches just to make sure that everything seems appropriate for the design that you're doing. And you'll kind of learn as you go what size of stitch looks best for what size of piece. And you really want to probably not go any narrower than a 2. At least a 2 is what I don't go narrower than on my machine, because anything smaller than that and it tends to just bunch up and be a bit weird. So I'm positioning the fabric under the machine so that the needle is just barely over the edge of the design. And I tend to do it based on the needle being on the right side, just because that makes sense to me. You can see here how the needle is like just ever so slightly over that edge, so that way the majority of our stitching is going to be towards the design piece. And that is just going to help secure that edge better. you can imagine as I start stitching how the needle's gonna move back and forth and cover up that edge. And you'll see in a minute when I start sewing. A lot of times when people first start doing applique, the instinct is to put the edge of the fabric right down the middle of the stitch, but that can actually lead to the edge of that design kind of pulling out over time because it's not as secure. Another thing to note is where I'm starting my satin stitch here. A lot of times it might seem like it makes sense to start at the corner or at the end of the point, but that can actually lead to more bunching because that's where the fabric is the least secure. So you might be kind of catching the edge a little bit, or, you know, it just is going to make it more difficult when you come back around to overlap in that area. So I like to start on a fairly straight spot so that I have, you know, some space to get going without having to turn immediately or anything weird like that. And that way I can continuously move all the way around the piece and not have to worry about starting in like an awkward location. So now I'm starting to sew, and this is the part that is most like you kind of just have to practice. So it can be difficult to kind of get the rhythm of how fast or slow the fabric is going to move through the machine. I am applying some pressure here and kind of helping it push along, but you just want to keep a very steady, even pace so that the machine stitching can keep up and be nice and dense. A lot of the time I find that I do actually have to go over applique twice, depending on your machine and, you know, how much you care about it being perfectly smooth. You may find that you only have to do the satin stitch once, but it really just depends. As I'm coming to the end of the corner here, I'm basically sewing all the way right up to that edge. And then I'm going to turn it and then start sewing without stitching over that stitch line that I just did. And that will help on the corners keep it from bunching up and getting too thick there. So I'm going to stop right at that edge and place the needle down so that I can then lift the foot and rotate it to continue down the other side. And you could just put the needle down and start sewing, but what would happen is that you would tend to get some bunching on that corner where that other line of stitching is. So instead, I'm going to lift the needle up and just scooch it forward ever so slightly so that I'm now starting my second line of stitching past where that other stitch line is. And here a clear foot really helps to be able to see what you're doing, or at the very least you want something like mine that is opened in the front or has a little clear bit in the front so that you can kind of see both where you're going and also as you're moving things around like this. And then I'm just going to start stitching again and continue on down that side. Now, as I get down to the curved part of the design, I'm just gently rotating the fabric as I go to follow that curve. And again, this is something that just takes a bit of practice. The shield design isn't too bad because it has a fairly gentle curve, and I can just kind of follow it without too much trouble. Now, if you have a design that has a tighter curve, what you might want to do is put the needle down and lift up the foot to pivot the fabric so that you can better follow that curve. Which side you put the needle down on really depends on which way the curve is going and if it's convex or concave, but you kind of just have to think about, okay, if I lift the needle and then pivot the fabric, is it going to leave a gap or is it going to be covered? You want to pivot it in such a way that the stitching covers up the fabric and doesn't leave a gap when you pivot it. I'm actually going to stop right there just for the sake of time and not satin stitch this whole thing. When you pull the fabric off the machine, you want to leave a bit of a tail when you snip the thread. We'll talk about why that is later. But here you can just see that that initial satin stitch, at least for the settings that I'm using on my machine, it looks fine, but you can see that it's not quite as smooth as maybe I would like it to be. There's like little gaps in the stitching. So I would like to go over it with a second pass. I'm going to show you just briefly on a small section what the difference looks like. Again, whether you do a second pass or not is entirely up to you, and it looks perfectly fine even if you don't do that. But if you want to get it extra smooth, we're going to go over it with a second line of stitching just to fill in some of those gaps. Now, once you've stitched through it once, your stabilizer is effectively nullified. You've stitched through it and it's no longer covering it. So you want to add another layer of stabilizer. Either tear off the first and add another layer, or just add that second layer and tear them both off at the end. I'm just going to fold over a little section of this because we're not doing a big section, and I just don't want to bother getting another piece of stabilizer out. So I'm going to start stitching right on top of my first line of stitching. On the second pass, I like to bump the stitch length up to a 0.1 on my machine. Remember that first pass is on a 0.0. If you're already stitching at a little bit above 0, you may not need to do this. You kind of just want to experiment and see how it feels for you. If you were stitching around the entire piece, you would come back around and rejoin your initial starting point. Depending on the shape and design of your piece, you most likely will have some kind of place where you come back around and overlap just a little bit. I like to give them just a little bit of overlap and then pull it off, get new stabilizer on, and then start the second pass. So here I'm just going to keep stitching, going down to that corner yet again. And just like the first time, I'm going to go all the way to the edge and then pivot so that I can continue down. In this case, I'm not actually going to pivot. I'm just going to sew to the end and stop for the sake of time because I don't want to go over this entire piece right now. So here you can really see the difference in 2 passes and 1 pass. So the top line there is the one that has gone over twice, and you can see it's shinier, it's smoother. When it hits the light, you don't see those little gaps, whereas the other side, you see the gaps a little bit more. And now I'm going to show you how to finish off the ends. So say you've done your second pass or you've done your first pass and you're happy with it, and you want to secure your stitching. Now it will be somewhat secure just by overlapping it with the beginning, but to make sure that it's really secure and that we don't have any weird little bits poking out, I like to flip it over to the back side and tug on that bottom bobbin thread until just a little bit of the top thread pulls through to the back side. Then you can take your seam ripper or whatever small implement and just pull it through. And then I'm going to tie those 2 tails together so that they are secured on the back side and there's no chance of it coming undone. I just do a simple double knot, and once it's tied, snip off the ends, leaving just a little bit, maybe like a 1/4 of an inch of length, so that it doesn't wiggle itself undone later. If you have a spot where the tail doesn't want to pull to the back side, if you're pulling on it and it seems like it's going to snap the thread or it just doesn't want to go, then it's secure enough. You can just snip it off and snip on both sides. Now I'm going to dab it with a little bit of fray check. This is like a fabric glue that essentially holds things in place and keeps them from fraying, hence the name. So I dab just a tiny bit of it on a Q-tip, and then I will dab that knot and that area where I tied it off just to make sure that it's extra secure. So down here we have another spot we need to tie off, but the stabilizer is kind of blocking it a little bit. You can't really get to both of the threads here. So I'm just going to tear away the stabilizer in that spot just so I can get at all my threads. And then it's much easier to pull the top thread through to this back side. Now, pretending that this is all tied off and we're good to go, then that's it. You can tear away the stabilizer, give your piece a good ironing, and then your applique is done. So moving on to the second piece, the flame design, I'm going to show you guys how I handle tighter curves and points because I get asked about that a lot. So once again, I'm applying a piece of stabilizer to the back and pinning it down. And that's going to keep everything nice and flat and smooth. So now I'm going to show you how I handle tighter curves like the one on this flame motif. You want to start where it's not so tight of a curve on, like I said, as straight of a part as possible. On this design, there isn't any part that is truly a straight edge, but you can get it straighter, you know, rather than being on a super tight curve to start. So I'm just going to start a little bit further up this flame piece. And I'm going to start stitching like normal and begin pivoting as I get down closer to the curve. And eventually you'll get to a point where it just doesn't feel like you can do it just by pivoting while the stitching is going. It just feels like it's going to run off the edge, and you kind of just get a sense for, okay, this is where I need to pivot. So now I'm going to put my needle down on the edge that is inside the design in this case, because the shape of this curve, when I rotate it, that way the stitching will be going back onto itself and not leaving a gap. So I'm just going to lift the foot and pivot and then keep on going. And then as I get down here to a point where it is getting a little tight again, then I will once again put the needle down, lift the foot, and pivot again until I get all the way around the curve. And here I'm turning it around so you can see how smooth that curve is and how I followed it all the way around, even though that was a fairly tight curve. Now you can see there is some roughness, and especially because this is a contrasting thread color, there's some spots where it skipped. And so especially when you're doing a very curvy design, this is where a second pass can be helpful, not only just to cover up those spots where the thread skipped a little bit, but also to just smooth everything out and make it a lot more even. So spinning back around, I'm just going to continue on down until I reach that point, and I'll show you how I do those. And essentially what we're doing is I'm going to gradually decrease the stitch width until it narrows down to the narrowest part of that point. Now, I don't really go lower than like a 2, for example, but you just want to get it narrower than what your stitch width was before, and that gradually decreasing is what's going to give us a nice crisp point. So I'm going to go all the way down to where the width of the stitch is about to be wider than the width of the fabric here. Zooming in so you can see hopefully just how close I am to that edge. And this is where I'm going to start to decrease. Now the amount you decrease, it depends a little bit on your machine, but on mine there's buttons, so I'm just going to hit the decrease button once and continue on. If you have a knob, you want to decrease it by just like one little tick of the knob and then move forward ever so slightly, literally sometimes just like 1 or 2 stitches until it starts to be too wide again. So I'm just going to go a couple stitches, decrease, go a couple more stitches, and keep decreasing gradually until I get all the way to the end of that point. And usually I don't go any narrower than a 2 on my machine, because after that it starts to bunch up weirdly and just the stitching kind of disappears. So I just kind of continue gradually on until I reach a 2. And how many stitches you do per level of decrease kind of depends on how long the point is, and so you'll just kind of adjust it as you go. And then I'm going to place the needle down, spin it around, and then we're going to come back doing kind of the opposite of increasing as I come back. Now, as you come back, you're not really looking for it to cover entirely like you were the first time, because it's already covered. So I'll start out at that narrowest width and go a little bit further than I maybe did the first time, and just kind of keep going a little bit, then go up a notch, keep going a little bit more, and then just gradually increase until we're back to the same width of stitch that we were at when we started. When I'm coming back from the tip of a point, I'm not necessarily trying to make the stitch the full width of the point, if that makes sense. I'm kind of going about halfway. So I'll go a little farther, like at the narrowest stitch, and before I increase each time, basically. You just want to make sure that you increase all the way to the full width of the stitch you were using before you get to the point where they split apart. And then you would just continue on stitching along that curve like normal. And here I'm not going to go all the way, just take it off and show you. Now you can see that point. It's nice and crisp. There is some parts where the blue is showing through. That's partly because this is our first pass. Normally I would do the point on the second pass and just stop at that part where it gets to be too wide, just short at the tip. That way, when you come back into your second pass, at the point, there's enough thread there that it is plenty covered. There's no problem, but the rest of it will already be mostly covered because you've got that first pass of the thread there covering it up. Now, if you want to only do one pass, I would suggest just making sure that you use a thread in the same color as your applique piece, because it's going to be a lot less noticeable when you're not doing a contrasting color. And that is really it for this applique tutorial. The presentation with more of the written instructions will be linked in the description down below, so please check that out and feel free to leave any questions in the comments. Thanks for watching.